The air was crisp that morning, with a faint chill that nipped at the edges of my confidence. I adjusted my blazer one last time before stepping out of the car, my breath fogging up the window as I exhaled slowly. This was it. The moment I'd been working toward for years. The interview of a lifetime. I clutched my portfolio tightly, the edges of the leather biting into my hands as if to ground myself. The towering glass building loomed before me, its sleek, mirrored surface reflecting the city skyline. It was intimidating, almost as though it were a silent gatekeeper, daring me to step inside. I hesitated for a moment, staring at my reflection in the glass doors. Brown skin, natural curls pinned back neatly, and a determined set to my jaw. For a fleeting second, I wondered if I looked out of place. "No," I whispered to myself. "You belong here." With a deep breath, I pushed the doors open and walked into the lobby. The space was pristine, polished floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights, minimalist furniture that screamed wealth, and a front desk that looked more like a sculpture than a functional piece of furniture. Everyone I passed was dressed impeccably, their heels clicking purposefully on the floor. I felt a few curious glances, but I brushed them off. This wasn't my first time being the only black woman in a room. The receptionist greeted me with a rehearsed smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm here for an interview," I said, my voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in my chest. "My name is Naomi Carter." She nodded briskly, typing something into her computer before looking up. "You're meeting with Mr. Harrington, correct? He's on the top floor. The elevators are just around the corner." "Thank you," I replied, giving her a polite smile as I headed toward the elevators. My heels made soft, rhythmic clicks against the floor, each step a reminder to keep moving forward. As I waited for the elevator, I couldn't help but glance around. Everything about this place exuded power and prestige, the kind of environment I'd dreamed of being a part of since I was a teenager. But even as I stood there, trying to focus on the opportunity ahead, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I didn't truly belong, that I'd have to prove myself 10 times over just to be seen as equal. The elevator dinged, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. The ride was smooth but felt endless, each passing second stretching longer than the last. I smoothed my skirt and adjusted my blazer again, rehearsing my opening lines in my head. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm excited about the opportunity to—" The elevator doors slid open, cutting off my thoughts. I stepped out into a hallway lined with glass walls and modern art. At the end of the corridor, a tall man in a tailored suit stood with his back to me, speaking to someone on his phone. I knew instantly that this was Mr. Harrington. His presence was commanding, his posture exuding authority. I walked toward him, my heels clicking against the polished floor. As I approached, he turned, his gaze sweeping over me with a flicker of confusion. For a brief moment, I thought he might offer a polite greeting. Instead, his brows furrowed, and he gestured vaguely toward a nearby supply closet. "The cleaning supplies are in there," he said curtly. "We've had some spills in the conference room. Make sure it's spotless before the meeting starts." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a second, I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, stripping away the confidence I'd built up all morning. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." He frowned, clearly impatient. "Yes, I'm sure there has been. I asked for the conference room to be cleaned 30 minutes ago. If you can't handle it, I'll find someone else who can." It took everything in me not to let my jaw drop. My pulse thundered in my ears as the weight of his assumptions settled over me. He thought I was the janitor. He hadn't even considered that I might be something else, someone else. My presence here, in this space, didn't align with his expectations, and so he'd slotted me into the only role he thought I could fill. For a moment, I considered walking away. The humiliation was suffocating, and my instinct was to flee, to escape the weight of his assumption. But then, a flicker of anger sparked within me, anger at the casual way he'd dismissed me, at the years of hard work that had led me here, and at the idea that my worth could be reduced to a stereotype. I straightened my spine, holding my head high. "Actually," I said, my voice steady now, "I'm Naomi Carter. I'm here for the 10 a.m. interview. Mr. Harrington's expression shifted, his confusion deepening as he processed my words. For a moment, he looked almost embarrassed, but just as quickly, his face hardened into a mask of professionalism. Right, he said, clearing his throat. Of course. My assistant must have forgotten to mention that you'd arrived. But we both knew the truth. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, as Mr. Harrington adjusted his tie and gestured toward the conference room. This way, Ms. Carter, he said, his tone clipped and formal, as though trying to erase the moment that had just transpired. My feet felt like lead as I followed him down the hallway, my mind racing. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the sting of humiliation still fresh. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk out the door, and never look back. But another part, the part of me that had fought tooth and nail to get to this point, refused to let him have that satisfaction. I didn't come this far to let someone's ignorance define me. As we entered the conference room, I forced myself to focus. The space was immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. A long, sleek table dominated the room, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than I made in a month at my last job. Mr. Harrington walked to the head of the table, his movements confident and deliberate, while I took a seat across from him. So, he began, flipping open a folder and glancing at my resume. You're here for the position of senior marketing strategist. Yes, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. I'm excited about the opportunity to bring my experience and vision to your team. He nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. You've got an impressive background. Graduated top of your class, worked on several high-profile campaigns. But I have to ask. He paused, looking up from the folder, his gaze sharp. Do you think you're ready for a position of this caliber? This isn't an entry-level role. The question felt like a challenge, his tone loaded with unspoken doubt. I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. I understand the demands of this role, and I've spent the last several years preparing for it. My experience leading multi-million-dollar campaigns has given me the skills and confidence to excel in this position. He raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. Confidence is important, he said, almost dismissively. But this is a fast-paced, high-pressure environment. We need someone who can handle the heat. I clenched my hands under the table, keeping my expression calm. With respect, Mr. Harrington, I've faced pressure my entire life. I know what it means to work twice as hard to be seen as half as capable. If there's one thing I've learned, it's how to thrive under scrutiny. His eyes narrowed slightly, and I could tell my words had struck a nerve. For a moment, there was silence, the tension between us palpable. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was my chance to prove him wrong, to show him that I belonged here. But as the interview progressed, it became clear that Mr. Harrington wasn't ready to let go of his assumptions. His questions were pointed, his tone skeptical, and though he never said it outright, I could feel the weight of his doubt pressing down on me. Still, I answered every question with poise and precision, drawing on years of experience and preparation. I told him about the time I'd turned a failing campaign into a record-breaking success, about the innovative strategies I'd developed that had set new industry standards. I spoke with passion and conviction, refusing to let his dismissive attitude shake me. Yet, beneath my calm exterior, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in the hallway. The way he'd looked at me, the casual way he'd assumed I was the janitor. It wasn't just insulting. It was a reminder of every barrier I'd faced. Every moment of doubt and insecurity that had threatened to hold me back. As Mr. Harrington flipped through my portfolio, I found my mind drifting to the moments that had brought me here. I thought about my mother, who had worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, teaching me the value of hard work and perseverance. I remembered the nights I'd stayed up late, studying by the dim light of a desk lamp because I was determined to be the first in my family to graduate from college. I thought about the countless times I'd walked into rooms like this one, only to be met with skepticism or outright hostility, the professors who'd doubted my abilities, the colleagues who'd taken credit for my ideas, the clients who'd assumed I was the assistant instead of the lead strategist. Each time I'd swallowed my frustration and pushed forward, knowing that my success would be the best answer to their doubts. And yet, no matter how much I accomplished, it never seemed to be enough. There was always another hurdle, another person who saw my skin before they saw my skills. But I refused to let their ignorance define me. I'd worked too hard to let anyone take away what I'd earned. Mr. Harrington closed the folder and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Well, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "you've certainly given me a lot to think about, but I have to be honest. There are other candidates with more experience in this specific industry." I nodded, though my chest tightened at his words. "I understand, but I believe that my fresh perspective and innovative approach could bring real value to your team. Sometimes, it takes someone willing to think outside the box to drive meaningful change." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That's true," he said finally, "but change isn't always easy, especially in a company like this one. It takes a certain kind of person to navigate these waters." The implication was clear. He wasn't sure I was that person. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt a spark of defiance. I wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, decide what I was capable of. "Mr. Harrington," I said, my voice steady and firm, "if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the greatest opportunities often come disguised as challenges. I've spent my entire career proving people wrong, showing them that success doesn't come from fitting a mold, but from breaking it. If given the chance, I'd do the same for your company." For the first time since the interview began, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just surprise. He leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "Well," he said, "you've certainly given me something to think about." The interview had officially ended, but the tension in the room still hung thick in the air. Mr. Harrington's words echoed in my mind. "You've given me something to think about." A deliberate choice of words, carefully vague and non-committal. I could feel the weight of his doubt pressing down on me, but I wasn't going to leave without addressing the elephant in the room. As he began gathering his papers and straightening the folder in front of him, I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. "Mr. Harrington," I said, my voice steady but firm, "before I leave, there's something I need to say." He glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Yes?" I clasped my hands together to keep them from trembling. "When we first met in the hallway, you made an assumption about me. You thought I was the janitor." His expression froze, his hands stilling over the folder. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning. He opened his mouth, as if to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. "I'm not bringing this up to embarrass or accuse you," I continued, keeping my tone measured. "But I believe it's important to address, because it's not just about what happened in that moment. It's about something much bigger." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he said, his voice carefully neutral. I took another deep breath, holding his gaze. "I've spent my entire life navigating spaces where people see my skin before they see my skills. Where they assume I'm less capable, less qualified, or less deserving because I don't fit the image they have in their heads. And every time, I've had to work twice as hard to prove them wrong." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but I pressed on, my voice gaining strength with each word. "I don't know why you made that assumption when you saw me this morning. Maybe it was unconscious, maybe it wasn't. But the fact that it happened at all is a reflection of the challenges women like me face every single day. Challenges that have nothing to do with our abilities or our potential, and everything to do with the biases people carry, whether they realize it or not." For the first time since the interview began, Mr. Harrington looked genuinely unsettled. His confident, polished demeanor cracked ever so slightly, and I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was processing my words, grappling with the truth of what I was saying. "I see," he said finally, his voice quieter now. I suppose I owe you an apology." I smiled faintly, though my expression remained serious. An apology is a good start, but what matters more is what happens next. It's not enough to acknowledge the problem. You have to actively work to change it. Not just for me, but for every woman who walks into this building, hoping for an opportunity to prove herself. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table in front of him. I could tell my words had struck a chord, but whether they would lead to real change was something only time would tell. As I stood to leave, Mr. Harrington spoke again, his tone hesitant. Ms. Carter, Naomi, I want you to know that I'll take what you've said to heart. And regardless of the outcome of this interview, I respect your courage and your honesty. I paused, turning back to face him. Thank you, I said simply, though the words felt hollow. Respect was nice, but it didn't pay the bills, or erase the years of prejudice I'd endured. Just as I reached the door, it opened, and a tall man in his early 50s stepped inside. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit that radiated authority, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back. His presence immediately filled the room, and I could see the flicker of recognition and apprehension in Mr. Harrington's eyes. Mr. Carter, Harrington said, standing abruptly. I wasn't expecting you. The man, my father, offered him a polite but cool smile. Clearly, he replied, his voice calm but firm. But I thought it was time I stopped by to check on the progress of the hiring process. I watched as the color drained from Mr. Harrington's face, his earlier confidence crumbling in an instant. He glanced between me and my father, realization dawning in his eyes. You're... he began, his voice faltering. Yes, I said, stepping forward. I'm Naomi Carter, and this is my father, Charles Carter, the chairman of the board. The shock on Harrington's face was almost comical. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, clearly struggling to find the right words. I didn't realize, he stammered. That much was obvious, I said, my tone sharp but controlled. But now you do. My father turned to me, his expression warm and proud. Naomi, is everything all right? How was the interview? I hesitated for a moment, glancing at Mr. Harrington. He looked like he wanted to sink into the floor, his earlier arrogance replaced by a desperate need to salvage the situation. It was enlightening, I replied, choosing my words carefully. My father nodded, his gaze shifting to Harrington. Good, because this company is built on integrity and respect, and I expect every member of my team, from the interns to the CEO, to embody those values. Harrington nodded quickly, his face pale. Of course, Mr. Carter. I assure you, this was just a misunderstanding. My father raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. I hope so, because if I hear otherwise, there will be consequences. The silence in the room was suffocating as my father's words lingered in the air. Mr. Harrington nodded furiously, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He looked like a child caught misbehaving, desperate to salvage what little authority he had left. But I didn't care about his discomfort. Not anymore. I wasn't here to make him feel better. I was here to reclaim my voice and my place. Naomi, my father said, turning back to me with a reassuring smile, why don't we step outside for a moment? I'd like to hear your thoughts. I nodded, grateful for the opportunity to leave the stifling tension of the conference room. As we walked down the hallway, the polished floors and sleek decor felt less intimidating now, like they didn't tower over me the way they had when I first arrived. Instead, I felt taller, stronger, as though the weight of the moment had lifted me onto a higher plane. We stopped by the large windows at the end of the hallway, the city stretching out beneath us. My father turned to me, his expression soft but curious. How do you feel? He asked. I hesitated, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. Honestly, angry, frustrated, tired of having to prove myself over and over again. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I understand. More than you know. But I also saw the way you handled yourself in there. You were calm, composed, and unapologetically honest. That's what real leadership looks like. I smiled faintly, though the weight of the situation still hung over me. I'm not sure it's enough, though. People like Mr. Harrington, they don't change overnight. No, my father agreed. But sometimes it only takes one moment, one person, to plant the seed of change. And whether you realize it or not, I think you just did that. His words stirred something inside me, a flicker of hope that I hadn't dared to feel in years. But even as I stood there, basking in his support, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't where I was meant to be. The thought surprised me. After all, I'd spent years dreaming of this opportunity, fighting tooth and nail to get here. But now that I was standing on the precipice of success, I realized that success, on its own, wasn't enough. "What are you thinking?" my father asked, his voice gentle. I took a deep breath, the words forming in my mind before I even realized I was speaking them. I think I don't want the job." He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Oh? Why not?" "Because this isn't the kind of environment I want to be a part of," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I've worked hard to get here, but I don't want to spend the rest of my career fighting to prove my worth to people who refuse to see it. I want to build something better, something where people like me don't have to fight so hard just to be seen." For a moment, my father simply stared at me, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He chuckled, his tone warm and proud. "Naomi, I've always known you were destined for greatness. But greatness doesn't come from following someone else's path. It comes from forging your own. And I think you're ready to do just that." The next morning, I sat at my dining room table, a cup of coffee steaming in front of me as I stared at my laptop. The events of the previous day played over and over in my mind. The humiliation, the confrontation, the decision to walk away. Part of me still felt raw, the sting of Mr. Harrington's assumption lingering like a bruise. But another part of me felt lighter, freer, as though I'd finally broken free from the chains that had held me back for so long. I opened a blank document on my laptop, the cursor blinking expectantly. For the first time in years, I felt a surge of excitement. Not fear, not doubt, but pure, unbridled excitement. I began typing, the words flowing effortlessly from my fingertips. "Welcome to the Carter Initiative, a new vision for workplace equality." The idea had been brewing in the back of my mind for years, but I'd always been too afraid to act on it. I told myself that I needed more experience, more connections, more validation from people like Mr. Harrington. But now, I realized the truth. I didn't need anyone's permission to chase my dreams. I didn't need to wait for the world to change. I could change it myself. The Carter Initiative would be more than a company. It would be a movement, a platform for underrepresented voices to thrive, innovate, and lead. It would be a place where people like me didn't have to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's mold. And it would start with me. The aftermath. A lesson learned. A few weeks later, I received an email from Mr. Harrington. The subject line read, "An apology and a request." I hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The message was brief but heartfelt. "Dear Ms. Carter, I wanted to take a moment to apologize for my behavior during your interview. Upon reflection, I've realized how my assumptions and biases clouded my judgment, and I deeply regret the way I treated you. Your words have stayed with me, and they've forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and the culture of this company. With that said, I'd like to offer you the position once again, should you change your mind. I believe you could bring incredible value to our team, and I'd be honored to work with you. Sincerely, James Harrington." I stared at the screen, my emotions swirling. Part of me felt vindicated, knowing that my words had made an impact. But another part of me knew that my journey wasn't about proving myself to people like Mr. Harrington anymore. It was about building something new, something better. I typed a quick reply. "Dear Mr. Harrington, thank you for your email. I appreciate your apology and your offer, but I've decided to pursue a different path. I wish you and your team all the best. Best regards, Naomi Carter." As I hit send, a sense of peace washed over me. I had nothing to prove to Mr. Harrington, or anyone else. My worth wasn't defined by their approval. It was defined by the work I was doing, the vision I was creating, and the legacy I would leave behind. Looking back on that day, I realize now that it was a turning point, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or undervalued. It reminded me that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you. It's something you carry within yourself, no matter where you go. And as I sit here, watching the Carter Initiative grow beyond my wildest dreams, I know one thing for certain: the best way to overcome prejudice isn't to fight for a seat at someone else's table, it's to build your own.